Right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Feed 209 and welcome to Feed, the Christian education program of Bartley Christian Church. And for all our guests and family members and all people from Bartley, whether you're from Bartley or our guests are invited, we welcome all of you tonight as we spend this privilege of learning together as we hear from our resource lecturer, Dr. Peter Ho, in preparation of our sermon series in the book of Psalm. My name is James. I am a ministry staff here at Bartley Christian Church. With me is Pastor Mayao Beng, our Christian education pastor. We welcome every one of you, and I hope you had a great night and that your hearts are open tonight to learn from the word and to take into heart the songs that was given to us by the Lord through the book of Psalms. For tonight, of course, we're excited and we I want to just quickly introduce to you our lecturer for tonight. So this Dr. Peter is my former lecturer. He's my professor at Singapore Bible College. So Dr. Peter is the vice principal of academic affairs and associate professor of Old Testament at Singapore Bible College School of Theology English. He was the former dean of the school and also directed the Center for Teaching and Learning at Singapore Bible College from 2021 to 2023. He was crucial in developing smart classrooms and communal learning spaces in the seminary. A specialist in Hebrew poetics, he researches the Book of Psalms and the Book of the Twelve and has published widely. Formerly a pastor and an engineer, he is married with four children. Without further ado tonight, let me give the time to Dr. Peter Ho to bless us.
Okay. So, well, let me begin by saying that the Psalms is something that most of us we love them, and that of the time we use it for a call to worship, but not necessarily something to think about, theologically. So I have really a few questions for you to begin with, just so that to get you to hear a bit from you as well. I will. I like to begin by asking you three questions. If you have your phones with you, please scan the QR code. First question is this: while the Psalms are familiar to me, I seldom hear it preached or taught. Yeah. Do you agree or disagree? Now, if you scan this code, you will get this question and you can click your choices. So let me see. Let us see how we do. Do we hear it preached or taught, or we don't really hear it preached or taught as much? Now, if you click on it, scan it, it should automatically show up here. Okay. Yeah. You can see some of them disagree. That's good. That means you have heard it being preached or taught. But most people, we still see a major group or proportion seldom hearing it preached or taught. Yeah. We have about 43 participants, so we have at the moment 25, 26. Yeah. So it's about 80-20. Yeah, we give it a few more seconds. Okay, last 10 more seconds. Let's see. Okay, so I guess the numbers are quite consistent. So about 75-25%. And this is true everywhere I go and ask among our students as well. Most people use it just for call to worship or for personal devotion, but not really preach. Okay, the next question is this. I think the Psalms should be best used as. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options for you. Just choose one if you can. You see, sermon is 0%. Yeah. Okay, now you see on this screen here, we have 77% for prayers and personal meditation. Call to worship, 3%. I'm surprised because most of us do that. Hymns and others, 13 and 10. But I mean, like you are having a psalm series, we have just 0 to 3%. So, well, the pastors may want to reconsider. But anyway, this is again suggestive of how we think about the Psalms, typically, only for personal meditations and reflections, an expression of how we feel inside. Not really a sermon. Hopefully, it will change after this series. Okay, I have one third question for you. Okay, one thing I hope to gain from this session, this is, I think, for you to type briefly. If you can type one word or 2 or 3 words, just to, give us an idea of what you hope to gain, or is it just typically just a bit more knowledge about the Psalms? Just write something so that we can get a sense of what you hope to get out of this. To learn why Psalms are written. Okay. Inspiration, prepare for big learning, deeper message. Maybe it's the pastors who are typing this. Deeper understanding, deeper meaning, how it instructs us, understanding. Yeah, heart of David. Proper framework to reach the Psalms. It's good. Deeper insights, quick way, quick perspective, insights. How to put into daily application. Now, this is interesting. This is something that is important. Feel personal appreciation, understanding. Yeah, grow in relationship with God, intimacy with God. Yeah, these are all on point. I'm glad to hear some of this intimacy with God, so on. Yes, yeah. Thank you very much on this. I think the Psalms is typically used, as a very personal thing to grow in deeper intimacy with God. And you have rightly so stated, some of you, to have a better understanding. That is, there's something theological about the Psalms. And this is something we hope to raise in tonight's session. What are some things that we need to grasp about the Psalm as a whole, so that we can better, appreciate and better apply. So let's move on. These are the 2 things that I want to do today. The first half of the session, I will teach you a bit about biblical poetry. That means I'm going to teach you how to read the Psalms, right? Like teaching you how to fish, so that you can read the Psalms and appreciate and understand it yourself. Yeah. I'm not saying that, this is like you don't know how to read it before. I'm just trying to show you some techniques that the psalmist use or the poet use, so that we are sensitive to some of these skills. And then when the eyes are open to to these techniques, you can begin to see many of these things yourself. The second half of today's session really is just the overview. That's where you come for as you begin your sermon series. What are some of the big picture across the book of Psalms? What does it talk about, and so on. So this will be after the break. Now let me begin with the first one: how to read the Psalms as biblical poetry. Now this is a very familiar one. All of us are familiar with this Psalms 23. Yahweh is my shepherd, I have no lack, green in pastures green makes me lie down, and so on. Highlighted, so I don't have to read this because we are so familiar with this. But if you look at the few words that I've highlighted here, in pastures green, beside still waters, paths of righteousness, and valley of deep darkness. Now, when you see these words, what comes to your mind? Yeah, I just want you to imagine, what you imagine it to be: pastures green or still waters, paths of righteousness. What does that actually mean? And I want to show you two videos, a few minutes each, just to give you an contextual understanding of, what really is green pastures and what is still waters and so on. And then you give you a better understanding of what is behind this psalm. Now you have a current understanding, but I want to show you what is really like in the land of Israel. This video is by this guy Vanderlaan, Ray Vanderlaan. I want to show you this video. Okay, on green pastures. Can you hear?
As part of the shepherd lesson, I did want to look at one thing in the wilderness that will maybe surprise you a bit. Believe it or not, this is called wilderness, midbar, but it's also called green pastures. Now, when you take a Westerner here the first time and you look at this, you find people say, well, I don't know that I can go there, because the Psalm 23, the Lord leads me into green pastures, has been pictured as belly deep alfalfa. Well, you haven't seen any belly deep alfalfa. And from biblical time to today, it's rare to see a flock in the farm country. There isn't a lot of farm country in this culture. And so farmers kept the shepherds out as much as they could. Maybe they would come in a little bit after the harvest to glean what was left, but you don't want sheep where you can farm. This is the land of the shepherd. Right on the hillside across from us, you can see those grazing trails cut there by sheep maybe as long ago as Abraham's time. They're spaced so that an animal on one path and an animal on another can reach right to the middle between them. That determines the distance, so you can graze an entire hillside. And the shepherds lead their sheep across that hillside slowly, grazing what's there. Now, you look at it from here and you say, what's there? In fact, I remember my first impression. I woke up one morning, I was sleeping out in the wilderness, and I remember waking up, watching a flock of sheep on a hillside like this, and my feeling was, what are those, rock-eating sheep? I mean, what do they eat? How can you call this green pastures? Well, the answer is there's a small amount of moisture present here. They get a little bit of rain every year. Not much, but a little. Second, there is humidity in the air, especially in the evening breeze. Like right now, you can feel it. Coming from the west off the Mediterranean, there's moisture in the air. That moisture, combination of the rain and the humidity, condenses or drips along the edge of these rocks here. And if you notice, right around the rocks, almost always next to the rocks, you get little tufts of green. Get one a moment. That's what we refer to as the green pastures. So the shepherd looks for a hillside. That's exactly what she was doing. Look at that flock across from us there. Just stunning. Those two shepherd girls have found a hillside that either was exposed to the wind or had that small amount of rain. And they move that flock across the hillside, and it's one mouthful here, walk a step or two, another mouthful, another mouthful, another mouthful. Now that changes the green pasture image a little bit, besides the picture changing radically. Green pastures are not everything you need for the rest of your life. If you make that belly deep alfalfa, then what God is saying, if you follow me, I'm going to plunk you down and you'll never have to move an inch the rest of your life. Just reach out and grab it. Tell me that your life with God has been like that. Worry, said one rabbi, is dealing with tomorrow's problems on today's pasture. In the desert, you learn the shepherd will get you what you need for right now. 10 minutes from now, you trust the shepherd. Just enough.
Okay, so that is a short video on green pastures, and if you hear it right, it really changes the whole idea or impression of what is a green pasture in Israel, right? It's not like an entire piece of green land where you can just lie there and don't have to move an inch, but it is, as we have heard, daily trusting. Have a bit here, and then you move on after it is gone, and trusting the shepherd to lead you to the next patch of grass. And I want to show you that it is like this. And I took this picture, and you can see really it's just rocks and grass patches here and there. And this is the green pastures of Psalm 23, not really what we imagine it to be, right? I want to show you another video a bit more. This one has got to do with the paths or tracks of righteousness. Yeah, he did mention earlier, but this is from another person, Halvor Ronning.
We're here in the heart of the Judean desert, about halfway between Jerusalem and Jericho, not far from the restored ruins of the Good Samaritan Inn, where people could hike halfway down, sleep overnight, and then continue the rest of the way. A dangerous area for human beings in this isolated wilderness with only a few shepherd camps. A danger that is attested to by the fact that not far from here are the ruins of Chateau Rouge, a French crusader castle to protect travelers along this road, where Jesus tells us the parable of the Good Samaritan, a man going from Jerusalem down to Jericho and fallen upon by thieves. But just now we're interested in the dangers to animals, to sheep and goats, because in this kind of a desert terrain, there's lack of water and lack of grass. And you need to be able to find out where to find food and water in order to survive. But this is not a trackless wilderness of moving sand dunes. This desert is full of trails and tracks, full of paths. In fact, there are dozens just up and down one hillside, because they're just far enough apart so that the sheep and goats can nibble whatever little remnants of grass are there, and that way clean off whatever little food is here on an entire hillside. So if you're a sheep and a goat out here and you're trying to figure out where to find water or grass, which path are you going to take? Not only that, we notice the rounded contours of the chalky hills, and how if you get on one of these paths and follow it, you may end up just circling around the whole hilltop and coming back right to where you were. And this is what helps us understand one of the phrases in Psalm 23. Yancheni b'ma'agale tzedek. He will lead me in, standard translation, paths of righteousness. Literal translation doesn't even make sense, in circles of righteousness. But now it does make sense, because the kinds of paths that are here in the wilderness sometimes literally circle right around and come back to where they were. And what you're learning from this multitude of confusing, circling paths is how totally dependent the sheep are on the shepherd to find the food and the water.
Hey, so this is another video on what it means to the path of righteousness. It's like a circle around a hill. The next one, this is not a video, this is just a picture to show you what it means, the deep, dark valley, the valley of the shadow of death. That translation, it's kind of something that we are used to, but really is deep valley. And what are deep valleys in ancient Israel, or even now? Remember just now in that video, he did mention about Jericho. Someone moving from Jericho towards Jerusalem is from a desert place with a lot of rocks like this, like ravines like this. And when you walk through this valley, it is because the walls are very steep, so there is very little sunlight, that can penetrate down to the valley. So it is dark, and typically it is dangerous because you could have animals, you can have predators, you can have robbers that hide along the way as you try to move. And you realize that these paths, you can't really walk around it. You have to walk through it to get to the other side. And this is, again, an imagery that we actually see of what it means to go through the valley of deep darkness. And how about quiet waters? When you think of quiet waters, what do you think of? There is actually very little, body of water in Israel. You have the Mediterranean Sea on one side, right? But we're not talking about the sea. We're talking about quiet waters. Where do you get quiet waters? You get a bit of river, say the Jordan River, for instance. So part of it could be the Jordan River. But, when David was running away from Saul, for instance, in this text here, 1 Samuel 24, you see when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So this place, wilderness of En-Gedi, is like this picture here. This is an exact picture. This picture here is in En-Gedi. So what you see is water that is literally coming out of the rocks. What does it mean? Now, if you look at another picture here, you can see this tree here. Can you see my cursor here? Like this little bush here. And you can see like a track here, like as if water, like a drain here, that water comes off from here. So what happens is that when there is rain in short periods of time in the year, it goes down on the hills, and then it goes into the soil and into the water table. But because these valleys, they have very steep walls, what happens is sometimes water would, break out from the side of these walls in the water table underneath, right? So it breaks out from this the walls of the valley, and then you form like little streams like this. And these streams, like this, they flow down, and that's where you get all the vegetation here. And sometimes they form a little pool of water at the bottom of this, and then a small little stream or a small little river that then leads all the way to the Jordan River. Now so quiet waters is like this, where David is hiding in places like En-Gedi, where you have pockets of water that flows up from the rock and moving through the valley. And it's a place of protection. It's a place where there is quiet waters, because you're not talking about major flow, but small streams like this. And that's where David refreshed himself when he is running away from danger from people like Saul. Now, this really changes the imagery of what it means when David said, lead me beside quiet waters. Just to give you a quick topological explanation, you can see En-Gedi is here. And this area here is very dry, just beside the Dead Sea. Now, when you move, say, from this area near Jericho here towards Jerusalem, you're moving from very dry area with steep ravines, and towards Jerusalem, as you can see, the rolling hills, and you can see more greenery on the left side here. And you can see this picture on top where you have trees and all that. That's where you come towards the mountain near Jerusalem. Whereas at the bottom here, like this whole area beside the Dead Sea, is all these kind of rocks. So you can see the topography of Israel is so varied, and you can move from one dry, rocky place to another that is very green and very fertile. And there are many places like this all around. So this is just to give you an understanding of the topology of Israel. Another imagery I want to share with you is this, this coffinet of Tutankhamun. You can see on the body, right, the hands are carrying a crook and a flail. Yeah. So, of course, this is Pharaoh, right? And Pharaoh, the symbol of his kingship is this crook and flail. Now, the moment I show you this, you can imagine that the connotation of, say, a crook will be, say, a shepherd. And indeed, it is so. The idea of shepherd in the ancient Near East is like a provider, a protector, a king, a leader. And this is, so when we say the Lord is my shepherd, we are not really talking just about, the shepherd per se, but we are really talking also about the protector, a king, a leader, a ruler, so to speak, because of this ancient Near East imagery of what a shepherd is. Now, having said that, let's come back to Psalms 23. And I want to show you a number of things. Basically, it's the same text. I just rearrange a little bit. And you can see Yahweh is my shepherd, I have no lack, and so on. And I want to show you a few things just so that you can appreciate this. The first, 3 verses, you can see that when the psalmist writes, it is between he and I, right? You can see he and me, So the psalmist is the first person, and then God, Yahweh, is the third person. But as you move downwards from verse 4 and verse 5, you see that the language changes, right? So it's between you and I. So you see, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me. So there's a shift. It's no longer using a third person and a first person, but it's using a second person and a first person. But it changes again towards the end in verse 6. Surely goodness and steadfast love shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of Yahweh. So again, Yahweh is a third person now. So there is this structural shape, that is beginning and end, and then the center is slightly different. You also see something else. The word Yahweh, God, the name of God, in the Hebrew is the third word in the psalm. And the only other place with Yahweh occurs in the third last word in the psalm, in Psalm 23. I mean, you can't see this in English, but in Hebrew is the third word and the last third word. Why is that so? It's almost like forming a symmetry, just like this 3-part structure thing. And what is also very interesting is that in the Hebrew, you have 26 words that kind of express the shepherd metaphor, right? And then you have 26 words that expresses the king and like a vessel kind of a language, covenant metaphor. I'll explain a bit more. But you have 26 words, and right at the center of Psalm 23, you have a 3-word in Hebrew. And these 3 words are, for you are with me. It talks about the presence of God. Now, so what is so interesting about this 26th word is that actually it forms the name of Yahweh. That is, in Hebrew, the letters, the Hebrew alphabet, the letters have a number that is attached to it, embedded with it. So YHWH is actually 10565. And then when you add them up is the number 26. In other words, you have the name of God. In this way, we call gematria, the number of God, which is the name, represents the name of God, embedded within the Psalm 23 itself, and highlighting the presence of God and the name of God within the Psalm. So you can see that even though it is just Psalm 23, as we have seen it, there's so much that is embedded within this one Psalm that brings out the message of the Psalm. Okay, let me say some more. Okay, now you can see on this slide, I've highlighted the words in green that represents the shepherd metaphor. You can see words like pastures, makes me lie down, leads me in paths of righteousness, like the shepherd that we saw earlier, leads me through the valley of deep darkness, as the shepherd leads. These are shepherd metaphors, right? At the same time, you see that there is a metaphor of the leader, the protector, the victor, the victory ruler, right? So you have staff, you have prepare a table before me in the presence of my foe. So this suggests something like a military background to this. You anoint my head with oil, right? My cup overflows. These are language of kingship, victory. The words pursue is the language of military. And I will dwell and I will return in the house of the Lord. Typically, when you have a king after the military victory, they will return to the house of God to give offering and so on. So you have actually two halves of the Psalms, 26 words about this idea of shepherd, and 26 words about this military covenantal framework of God is king and he will take care of his people. So this is Psalms 23. Now, what I've just done for you is to bring you behind or around the Psalms, to open your eyes to see there are some things that is part of the Psalms. So the impact of social history, geography, topology, language, literary form has on interpretation. In other words, now when you read Psalms 23, you cannot read it with the same pair of eyes, like green pastures. Suddenly it takes on a different thing. It's not like you don't have to move. In fact, you have to move every single, day, after the bread is good enough for today. And tomorrow you have to trust. So green pastures is not $1 million bank account. A valley of the shadow of death is the only way is you have to go through it, but trusting the shepherd leading you through it, because it's steep valley, you can't go around it. And through it, you have dangers and evils, predators to be expected, and so on. Quiet waters, it gives you this imagery that is, water coming out from the rocks to supply you when you're hiding from your enemies, paths of righteousness, and so on. And you see, I mentioned about the shape of the Psalms, the two main metaphors, the he, me, you, me, he, me shape of the Psalms, and then the central idea of God's presence and so on. So all of this has a role to play in helping you see more in the Psalms. But at the end of the day, you kind of see that Psalms 23 is no longer the same Psalms 23 that you are typically familiar with. There's so much into it, so much richer. And with the shape and structure, it focuses on the presence of God, like God being with you, and so on. So if you hear, in other words, what I'm trying to say is once you see all this, it directs you to what is at the central or heart of the Psalms, and it prevents you from interpreting any way you like it. and will keep you on target in your interpretation. Okay, so I showed you an example. I showed you the value of learning how to understand Hebrew poetry a little bit. I'm going to show you more. Just want to say that biblical poetry is never poetry for poetry's sake. That is, it is trying to highlight something, trying to bring out a theological message. And in Psalm 23, a key message is the presence of God, right? His protection, his providence, he as a shepherd and a king, right? And that the things that we will face, the danger that we'll face, the daily struggle that we'll face, they are all part of the imagery. Yeah, so all this serve the message. Okay, it's not just to say something about the beauty or emotions, or to raise the emotions that we have, but there is a theological message. This is in contrast with Romantic poetry. Romantic period is after the Enlightenment period. Is where people begin to rebel against rationalism, against the strict rules of religion, of morality, of and so on, and then they try to free themselves by embracing the aesthetics. But this, what Charles Taylor is saying, that this kind of poetry frees people, but there is no there's no undergirding or anchor to what is true and what is real and what is of divine. And that is what this paragraph here is saying. The kind of romantic poetry that we see, these language functions, they have power to move us, right? But without having to identify their real commitments. That is, it is detached from any moral obligations. And this is what offers a place to go for modern unbelief. When you are disgruntled with things, you want to look at the beauty, the arts, but this is a response to the inadequacy of moralism, and the missing goal can be identified with the experience of beauty in the realm of aesthetic, but is unhooked from the ordered cosmos or the divine. I'm showing you this because I want to show you that there is a difference between biblical poetry and the other poetry around us. Okay, let me move on. So for biblical poetry is different because it's highly theological. It's not just for an individual, but it is for a group of people, the body of Christ, to teach, to recall, to express the works of God, to reshape our worldview, into the ways of God, not the ways of the world. It has a purpose to shift our mindset, right? It's not to free our mindset to anything that goes, but it is to align our thoughts to a particular way. It has a polemic against cultures, religion, and it is belief in the divine, spiritual truth and meaning. It carries all of that. It is not untethered from anything else, right? It is to inspire faith and action. It is to offer us a world that is anchored to God and His ways, and this is significant, okay? And yet it is adaptable. That is, as much as the Psalms apply to the psalmist in his days, it can still apply to us in our own context, in our own days. So let me quickly share with you some of the distinctive features of what is the biblical Hebrew poetry. There's 4 of them. You can see here parallelism. Parallelism is something that you say and then something that is similar. The second part of it is similar to, I'll explain a bit more. Terseness about Hebrew poetry is like sometimes a certain word that is used in the first line. Let's say we have 2 lines of poetry. The words that are used in the first line, sometimes they are not present in the second line, but you assume it is there. It's like what we call very succinct or efficient use of words. The ideas are already there, so they skip the words. So Hebrew poetry has this feature. It's very terse, very short. It makes you imagine and fill in the gaps. Yeah, because the idea is already presented in the first line. So there's this sense, it doesn't tell you everything. It wants you to almost like imagine and contribute your understanding to what is written, right? To imagine that. Then there's a lot of figures of speech, a lot of metaphors that we have seen, and there's a lot of structure involved. It's highly technical. It's highly, it's not random. You know, even when we read certain psalms that is filled with emotions, you know, like ranting even, but they are actually highly structured and highly skilled. Yeah, even though it feels very free and emotional. So these are 4 distinctive features, and I'll share briefly on parallelism and poetic structure. Yeah, give me a few more minutes before we take a break. Yeah, so parallelism is basically a literary pattern that states an idea in one line and focuses more closely on the same idea in the following line, either repeating the thought in a different terms or focusing on the thought more specifically. Now, what do I mean by this? Okay, let me share with you. Now, this is parallelism is a kind of repetition. Now, by using different ways of repetition, we get something like parallelism, we get symmetry. Now, what does it mean? Just follow along with me if you can. Now, basically, symmetry is like when we look into the mirror. You see something A, line 1, line 2 is saying something the same, maybe a bit different, but it's quite close to A. This is what we call symmetry. Ken, this is quite simple to understand. Now, something like symmetry as well, but you have 2 things here. You have A and B. Now, if this is the mirror surface, it reflects back B and A. Okay, so line 1 is AB, but line 2 is BA. So they form like a V shape, you know, like a mirror image. Yeah. So this is what we call chiasmus. I'll give you more examples later on. Now, parallelism is AB and A prime, B prime. That is the same thing, but it is in the same order. Now, this is the reverse order, A, B, B, A, right? But parallelism is the same order, A, B, also A prime, B prime. Yeah, so they are similar things, but then one is a mirror image, one is not. Okay, so now you learn this, you basically can see a lot of things. Yeah, these are the basic things that recurs again and again. The last one I want to share with you is this technique called asymmetry. Now, asymmetry basically means you have something like AB, AB, right? They are consistent. But suddenly you have an oddball called C. It's asymmetrical. Like this is, you don't fit anywhere. It doesn't mirror image or anything. It just stands out on its own. Now, this is also a technique. That is, it is non-repetition. Now, when you have this oddball, sometimes the poet is trying to highlight something. Everything else fit nicely, but suddenly you have an oddball, and this serves to highlight the importance or significance of it. Now, with just these 4, you will be able to see many things. I give you an example here. This is Psalms 113, verse 4. You can see that this is a AB structure. The Lord is high above the nation. The Lord is A. High above the nation is B. Now, the second line, His glory is above the heavens. So this is A prime, this is B prime. Do you see that? A, B, A prime, B prime. Yeah, so it's very easy to see. The Lord and His glory is parallel. These are both A and A prime. This is B and B prime because high above the heavens, right? So you can see this is the AB structure. Another example, AB, let those be ashamed, be humiliated who seek my life. Let those be turned back and dishonored who delight in my hurt. So again, this is identify the subject and what they do, and then this is the implications of these people. Again, it's AB prime. So you can see you have just learned what is parallelism, right? So it's quite easy to see them once you understand how it works. Now, what about chiasmus symmetry? Now, another example is here 107 verse 16. You have a ABBA. For he has shattered gates of bronze and bars of iron he has cut asunder. Do you see that? Now, these two, they belong together. So the two baseballs here, gates of bronze and bars of iron. So you can imagine there is a mirror line or center line across these two, right? Yeah, so it's A, B, B, and so this is shattered and cut asunder. Another one here, ABA 27 verse 14. Wait for the Lord. And you have wait for the Lord. So you have apple, apple at both ends. At the center, you have something different. Be strong and let your heart take courage. This is the oddball, the baseball. So this is the ABA. Now remember, we saw in Psalms 23 a structure like this already. We have a he, I, he, me at both ends. At the center is a you, I, you, right? So that is an ABA structure occurring at the entire psalm. But here you have in one line. So you have learned another one already. Okay, now I skipped this one because of time, but I want to show you this very quickly. Now just read this through from top to bottom on loneliness. I'm lonely. I cannot say that. I've always been alone. Although now I know fate meant for me to be this way. I have nobody. I would be wrong to say someone would care. If I tried again to destroy myself, the effect would be massive, only if I was perfect. It's true that I could have worth. Even if I try, I'm less than beautiful. Nobody can convince me that I am right where I'm meant to be. Now, so this is loneliness. But if you read from bottom up, I'm right where I'm meant to be. Nobody can convince me that I'm less than beautiful. Even if I try, it's untrue that I could have worth only if I was perfect. The effect would be massive if I tried again to destroy myself. Someone would care. I would be wrong to say I have nobody. Fate meant for me to be this way. Now I know. Although I have always been alone, I cannot say that I'm lonely. Now, you see, when you read top down, it's loneliness. When you read bottom up, it's just being alone. You're not lonely. It's a reverse. Now, what I've just tried to do is this. Direction of reading affects meaning, right? So text can create shapes. Shape of text affects reading and meaning. And the direction of reading affects the meaning, all right? And the form of the whole poem is part of the message. So you can see, actually you can do a lot with words, depending on how you do it. And if you're creative enough, you can imbue certain message or ideas depending on how you shape it for reading. And I want to say that the Hebrew poet does a lot of this. He shapes a text in a particular way so that meaning is embedded in it depending on how it's shaped. Okay, we will talk more about this, but I think maybe we should take a break now. We can come back and look at another psalm. But before we do that, maybe I will stop share and have you and take some questions.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's continue. You can go through questions. Correct. Thank you.
Okay. Now, there's two questions I see here. One by Belinda. The question is, the last point you shared about loneliness, I think it was this one. It's very interesting, but how does that relate to the psalm? Now, you see that when you read from top down, there's one message, right? So the direction of reading produces one way of understanding a message. But when you read it in a different direction, you see that the meaning changes. And that is what I'm trying to say here. The direction of reading affects meaning. And how does that affect how does that relate to the Psalms? And I want to show you in just a bit. For instance, in an example in Psalm 67, typically when we read the Psalms, we read it from top down. But what if you can read the Psalms maybe not from bottom up, but from the center outwards, right? So when you read it in a different way, the meaning changes. And I will explain that to you in just a bit with another example. The second question here is, do we apply parallelism on all Psalms? Any exceptions? Now, the entirety of the book of Psalms is poetry. And a key part of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. So in other words, almost 99-100% of Hebrew poetry, you will see some sort of parallelism or repetition or some kind. So I won't use the word apply. Maybe we can rephrase the question a bit. Do we typically see parallelism in all Psalms? And if that is the question, the answer is yes. So it is more like we are trying to describe, characterize what Hebrew poetry is. And that is why we say that a key characteristic is parallelism. We don't apply parallelism on the Psalms. The Psalms itself show us whether there's parallelism or not. So we just need to learn the skills of what parallelism is and see if they are there in the Psalms. And basically that's really it. Okay. So if there's no more questions, I'll move on.
There's still two questions
Okay.
from Dr. Professor Joseph and from Ruby.
Okay. How do I see? Let me click on this. Okay.
Click on refresh.
Okay. Okay. Can a person who doesn't read Hebrew nor an expert in identifying Hebrew poetry read from the Psalms? Are we losing out? Okay. Well, the good thing is once you learn these techniques, right, these skills in English, like what we are doing today, you can begin to appreciate like its presence there. You may not be able to see all the nuances. For instance, you will not be able to say count the words or to identify, deeper meaning, but it will not prevent you from identifying very obvious parallelism or structure at work. That means, given the translation that we have, English translation nowadays, we are talking about very good translations, but a lot of these translations are what do you call translated in such a way that it reads nicely in the English. That means it is clean up in the English, right? So that when you read it in English, it flows fluently. But they may not be the exact syntax the original Hebrew is. In other words, even if you read the best English translations today, you may not get the same syntactical structure of the Hebrew. So what you want to do is, if you want to really appreciate this, you can do two things. Number one, if you don't know Hebrew at all, you may want to find, and you want to kind of appreciate Hebrew poetry, you may want to find a version that is very literal, an English translation that is as literal as possible. So you could consider like NASV, ESV is a bit less. You can even consider the Young's literal translation if you want to. It's a very old version, but it is literal. When I say literal, meaning a particular Hebrew word is typically translated in the same English word, right? So they don't change the English word as much. They try to follow the same English word. So you can see words that is of the same Hebrew word, the same English word. So you can identify the repetitions easily. Another way is to use, I guess that would be the main thing. So there will definitely be missing out some things without being able to read Hebrew, but it is not like you cannot see some of this in the English, because whatever I'm going to show you next, it'll be all in English. Yeah. Okay. So is there another question? Sorry.
Yeah, there's another question from Ruby.
Yeah. So Ruby is about parallelism on all psalms and the exceptions, right? I've kind of answered that. Is there another one following that?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Okay. Let me go on. Now, this is Psalm 67. Okay, Psalm 67. You can see this is from your English Bible, from the ESV text. You can see a number of things here. You can see a ESV given title, Make Your Face Shine Upon Us. Okay. Now, this is not in the Hebrew. You don't know that, right? Because it's just part of the words on the page, but it is not in the Hebrew, it's supplied. The words here, to the choir master with string instruments, psalm a song. This is a psalm superscription. It is in the Hebrew text and it is originally verse 1, but it is given verse 0 here. Okay. Now, you can see gaps here between verse 3 and 4, right? This is again supplied by ESV. It's not there in the Hebrew. But when you see this gap, you kind of see a break between verse 3 and 4, right? It forces you to see a break, but there's no break in the text. And you see parallel lines and indents by ESV. You see, let the nations be glad and sing for joy for you, judge. So the word for and guide you is kind of indented. Seems to suggest it is second or secondary to the main clause. It's not the main clause. Then you see verse numbers, all this 1 to 7. Actually, because this is given, the superscription is given verse 0, is all shifted by 1. So the Hebrew has 8 verses, verse 1 in the superscription, and then so on. And then you see gaps between the word earth and Selah. Again, there's no gap there. All these are supplied. What I want to say to you is this. This already is an interpretation by the ESV editors. Okay, so these things that are supplied, the gaps, already shape your reading in some ways on the text. Now I want to show you the actual text here. I mean, I just use the same just to help us. Now you can see the first thing here is that in these 7 verses, you can see that there are what we call 2 lines. One I labeled 1, 2, right? God is gracious to us, bless us, and cause his face to shine upon us. So first line, 1, line 2. We call this bicolon, but don't worry about this. I just want to show you. You see verse 1 has 2 lines. Verse 2 has 2 lines, right? 2 clauses. Verse 3 has 2 clauses. And then verse 5, all this 1, 2, 1, 2. But the only one that is asymmetrical is verse 4. You have 1, 2, 3 lines. Do you see that? Now, why I want to show you this? Because I want to point out this technique called asymmetry, right? Which we have kind of looked at about a while back. And this asymmetry is formed by verse 4, which is at the center of this whole psalm, and by adding 1 additional line, right? The rest is all 2 lines, but here you have 3 lines. And now I want to show you why. Why is it so? Now, this is the same Psalm 67. Now, we have learned the different techniques, right? So let me give you an example. Verse 2, you have your ways be known on the earth. Your salvation, this be known is not there. This is what we call terseness, gapping. You supply yourself, your salvation among the nations. So this is a A-B parallelism, right? We have learned this. So it's occurring in verse 2. Now, how about verse 3? Verse 3 is a A-B-A. See, let the people praise you, O God. Let the people praise you. So at the center, you have this oddball that's happening here. But verse 4 is like totally different, right? A, B, C. Okay. So at the line level, at the verse level, you see these 3 things at work. Now I want to show you the next slide. Now, this sort of techniques also occur at the strophe level or paragraph, we could say paragraph level. Now, if you look at verse 3, 4, 5, what you see in these 3 verses is like a paragraph that is occurring at a B, A manner. It's like a chiasm, right? It's like these 2, 3, and 5, they're exactly the same, right? But verse 4 is different. So do you see that if we just draw 2 dotted lines, verse 3 to 5, you see a ABA kind of a structure, right? So the kind of parallelism, the different techniques, different repetitions can occur not just at the line level, but also at the paragraph level. But it can also occur in the entirety of the psalm. Now, let me explain. Just now we look at verse 3, 4, 5, right? So this is like A, B, A, P, Q, P. I say P, Q, P, right? So this is one strophe. But the first 2 can be one unit as well. So A, B, A, B. And then the last 2 verses can be A, B, B, A. See, the earth has yielded its produce. God bless us. God bless us. All the ends of the earth may fear him. Now, I have done the work for you, but I want to show you that actually the different kinds of techniques, repetition, is not only occurring at the single line, it can occur across a few lines. It can also occur across the whole psalm. Now, when you see this happening across the entire 67, you see that this whole psalm is also divided into 3. The first 2 psalms, the first 2 verses, you see the idea of blessing, right? I highlighted the words in blue. God be gracious to us, bless us, cause his face to shine upon us. So you have the idea of blessing at the end as well, verse 6, right? The earth as yielded its produce, God bless us, right? And then you have the idea of that your ways may be known on the earth. And then you have the end of the earth may fear him. The idea of like God's, blessing or his way is kind of extended to all nations. Again, this is a repetition at the beginning and at the end. And that is why I say that strophe 1, or this paragraph, 2 lines here and these 2 lines here, they kind of parallel each other, right? At the center, you have, again, something like this, the PQP and the odd, these 2 are the same ideas, P and P, right? The idea of praising. But at the center, you have something that is asymmetrical. So the question is, why is there asymmetry? Why is there a focus at this center? Now you look at this whole psalm. You see that at the center, you have the content here that's slightly different. That is the character of God. For you will judge the people with uprightness and guide the nations. This idea of judging and uprightness is kind of different from the rest of the psalm. You have blessing, you have the idea of being sent out, people make known across the earth, blessing, and then the ends of the earth will fear him. You have the ideas of people praising God, but at the center, you have something different. You have the idea of God's character. Now, this comes back to the question of Belinda earlier on. Now, we typically read the Psalms from top to bottom, if you read it this way. When you read it this way, top to bottom, you kind of don't see anything. You kind of see repetitions and everything. But the moment you see this psalm in this way, and you read from the center outwards, that means you begin with the center, with the character of God. And then you see that people begin to see who God is, give praise, and then the idea of it moving outwards to the end of the nations, and that the blessing will go out to the ends of the nations. You see this psalm entirely different, because now the heart of the psalm is the idea of God as judge, as the righteous one, and that is the basis on which you get praises, you get blessing, you get the extension of his blessing to the ends of the earth. So this really changes the way you interpret the Psalms. So it comes back to the question earlier on of the direction of reading, the form, right? The text shapes the form, and the form affects the meaning depending on how you read it. And this is a characteristic of Hebrew poetry. Now, on this slide, I have, like a gear that is made out of like a jigsaw puzzle of gear. What I'm trying to say here is that there are many different things that is at work in Hebrew poetry. For instance, you have the structural shape, you have macrostructural devices, you have terseness, you have parallelism, you have repetitions, you have numerical devices, you have semantic content. They all come together, fit nicely together, so that the whole thing moves. In other words, what I'm trying to say is when you try to understand a psalm, you have to grab all these different techniques or ideas and see how they kind of fit all together. And then at the end of the day, when they all fit together nicely, you then begin to see the message of the psalms. Yeah, this is what I'm trying to say. What I've just done is to show you how to look at Hebrew poetry, and hopefully you gain a bit of understanding. So with the rest of the time, about 25 minutes or so, I'm going to share a bit of an overview of the whole book of the Psalms. Okay, so let me change gear now. Now that you have learned a bit of poetry, you get a little bit of taste to it. Let's talk about the whole book of Psalms as a whole. Now, in Hebrew, the name of the book of Psalms is Sefer Tehillim, which means Sefer is book, Tehillim is praises, is book of praises. In the Greek, you have the book is called Psalmoi, which means songs, or Psalterion, which means string instruments. That is how we get the English title. The Psalms really is from Greek. But both of them, they come together to form a very nice, a book of praises or a book of Psalms. Really captures the whole idea. A book of praises really is, from the praises that we see in the Psalms. Like even in the lament Psalms, it typically ends with praises. I was talking to the pastoral team that the book of Psalms really begin with the idea of blessedness and end with hallelujah, praises. And that is why you have this idea of praises. Now, this is quite significant. All right, this is quite significant. Why so? Now, just look at this statement first, and I'll explain what I mean. A case can be made on the basis of the Psalms that the purpose of human existence is to praise God. In a world that has become increasingly more human-centered, that may sound like an anomaly. How could anyone realize self-fulfillment and achieve his or her goals in life by praising God? Now, what he's trying to say is this, life in general is very self-centered. We kind of look to ourselves. Even when we read the Psalms, we are reading it for ourselves. It's kind of like a self-centered way of dealing with God. We want our emotions to be heard. We want our feelings to be expressed. It's a lot of self. But the thing is, because this book is a book of praises, it's actually an emptying of the self and giving praises to God. It is turning from one own self towards God. When you praise God, you are surrendering yourself, to who God is and His goodness and His greatness and so on. You are trying to minimize and to give credit to who ought to receive the credit. And that is why the Psalms is so beautiful, because on the one hand, it helps us express our feelings, right? It draws us into our inner world. But at the same time, it's telling us to turn all these inner feelings and surrender all of that to God, to be able to praise God. If you read the Psalms and you're constantly just being sorry about yourself, then you would have missed the point of the Psalms. Because at the end of the Psalms, it is hallelujah, it is praising God, it is giving God the glory for all things. And this is important, theologically an important point based on the book, the name of the book itself. And you see a number of features here on the Psalms. These are just generally speaking. You see there are many ancient imageries and parallels. It begins from happy and ends with hallelujah. You have 5 books in the Psalms, actually. If you All you need to do is to turn to Psalm 1, you see at the beginning it says book 1. If you turn to Psalms 42, you see book 2. There are actually 5 books. If you turn to books, Psalm 73, you see book 3, and so on. There are multiple collections. That is, sometimes in the superscription you have like of David. Sometimes you have a song of Solomon, a song of Moses, a song of Asaph, a song of Korah, for instance. So it has different collections depending on these superscriptions. It is 100% poetic. And these psalms, they are varied. Sometimes it can be a psalms of lament. Sometimes it can be a historical psalms, right? Psalm 78, Psalm 70, and so on. They describe history like 105, 106, 107. They kind of trace history, even in a poetic form. And a lot of the psalms have superscriptions. There are a number of psalms without superscription. About half the book of Psalms is Davidic. That is, it has the superscription of David. I won't talk more about this. If you're interested, we can discuss this further. But there's a lot of debate about whether is it authorship or just attributing to David and so on. Now, of recent, in the last 30, 40 years, there has also been a lot of research on reading the Psalms as a book. I'll talk briefly about this. That is, we typically read the Psalms as individual poems. Right? You select this Psalm, you read this, you choose this Psalm. They are like independent, like a cookbook, right? Sometimes you use the term anthology. You can choose anyone, it doesn't matter. But the last 30, 40 years, the scholarship has begin to see how these individual psalms are kind of connected. They kind of form a story. There is an arrangement, there's an order across, so you cannot simply just pick and choose. That is, in other words, if you look at one psalm, you can see within its own literary context, there is a progression, there is a storyline. And this is really something that is something I will share with you, and also my area of research. So these are some features. Maybe I will skip this, but I just want to show you, like I mentioned here, many ancient Near East imageries. Right? You see in this excerpts of Marsili, basically this is 1310 BCE, is Hittite cuneiform text. And you can see the words here. You don't even have to read it, just look at the words in purple. You see they're very similar to the expressions that we see in the Psalms. Okay, this is a prayer, have mercy on me, oh Lord, that kind of thing. So what I want to say is the Psalms is not totally different. It reuses some of these ideas that we see in the ancient Near East. And I mentioned to you there are different types of Psalms, right? There are Psalms that are just praise, right? Hymns. There are communal laments, individual laments. There are Psalms of thanksgiving. The numbers here are the examples of this kind of genre. Psalms of confidence, Psalms of remembrance, like Psalm 78, I mentioned to you, is like a historical Psalms, right? Psalms of wisdom, right? Psalms of kingship, and there are Psalms that don't fit in any of these boxes. They call it a mixed genre. But basically, there are different kinds, right? So this is what we call genres, different genres, genre types, okay? You don't have to worry about form criticism, but basically, scholars kind of classify them into these groups using certain techniques. So Psalms of Lament, and scholars have found that, even with a particular genre like a lament Psalms, there is a certain structure in a Psalm. So it first begins with an address, for instance, then the actual complaint itself, the lament, then there is a confession of trust, there's assurance, there's petition, there's vow of praise, and typically it ends with a praise when the prayers are heard. So scholars have found, like for instance, by Klaus Westermann, he saw this in lament Psalms. I give you an example. In Psalm 3, you see it begins with an address, oh Lord, how many are my foes? So the oh Lord is like calling out to God, right? And then the lament, the how many are my foes, and so on. Many, there's no salvation. This is the complaint itself. Then there's a confession of trust. But you, O Lord, are sure about me. And then there is assurance. I lay down, I awoke again. The Lord sustained me. Then there is a petition, right? Arise, O Lord, save me. This is where you begin to pray and ask for something. And towards the end, you have this vow of praise. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So you move from address, lament, a confession of trust, and all the way to petition and praise. So this is what scholars have found. Maybe not all these categories will occur in every lament song, but in general, most of them you see. So the Psalms of Lament, just to give you an example here, basically I won't go through all the different genres, just to share a lament. That this Psalms of Lament, typically you can lament against God, you can lament against enemy, you can even lament against yourself, and in these Psalms you often hear raw emotions, right? God, why this, why that, but lament Psalms are never without hope and trust. Yeah, it typically comes with the vow of, I mentioned here, right? There's a petition, there's always this confession of trust and assurance, right? And you can see they are not random ventings, but they have a very specific, in fact, very technical form. And it is based on themes, can be sickness, can be persecution, it can be sin as well. So this is just to give you a taste of typically what is a typical Psalm of Lament. Also give you an overview now, because the Psalm is so well loved. The term reception of the Psalm is how people have kind of interpreted the Psalms or appreciated or adapted or used the Psalms, and from antiquity all the way to the period of Reformation. So you see, as early as before the New Testament and period, the Psalms have been used in different ways, in Qumran Psalter and Septuagint Psalter. Some of this, they are translation, but they also add certain words. And from the words that they add or the certain Psalms that they reorder, for instance, in Qumran Psalter, they bring out certain things. So you can see how they receive the Psalms in different ways. So, of course, in the New Testament, Jesus used the Psalms. The New Testament authors use the Psalms in different ways. They quote it and they interpret it differently, right? The writings of church fathers, and then you have the first few centuries with the Jewish Talmud, Midrash. They all interpret the Psalms, right? And you can learn from this interpretation how they view the Psalms and so on, all the way to the Reformation. So this is how it looks like. I don't need you to read this clearly, but this is the Qumran Psalms. You can see the words in Hebrew here. Yeah, this is how it looks like when it's being written on scrolls, the Dead Sea Psalm scrolls. Now this is the Greek Psalter. It's called the Duke Papyrus because it is housed at Duke University. So it's written in Greek words, and then this is Psalms 50. Again, this is a 6th century Byzantine Greek inscription. So it is found, in the Judean desert. This is what our English Bible is based on, the Hebrew Leningrad Codex. You can see how it's being written. This is 1008-09 CE. So it's about 1,000 years ago. And you can see that there are gaps here, like spacing. There are certain things here that is written at the end that has no meaning. It's to form a straight line. You can see, I think they're trying to form like a very nice column here. And there are marginal notes at the side here. Okay, so just to give you an idea. This is in the 9th century. You have what we call the Utrecht Psalter. This is written in rustic capitals. But what I want to show you is that you can see illustrations here. This is Psalm 2. Okay, Psalm 2. From these pictures, you see how this person, the editor, interprets the psalm, right? From the drawings, it is an interpretation. So this is from when you look at this, you actually can see how people interpret the psalms. Similarly, in the Palmer Psalter, you have these are what we call illustrated psalters. When they have the text here, but sometimes they have like different drawings like this. This is like the builder of God's house. Of course, they don't use bricks, but by the time a Palmer Psalter is written, you have bricks, right? So it gives you a glimpse of the interpretation of Psalms at this time, in this context, and how they read that into the Psalm. So when you read illustrated psalters like this, it's very interesting because you see how they are being interpreted. Another example is the Luttrell Psalter. You see bullock carts and so on. Yeah, all these illustration. These are all very expensive to produce. It's typically funded by a patron. Only the wealthy get to do this. But with all this illustration, it depicts the daily life of the people living at that time. And the Psalms is used also in the Catholic Church in the Mass, and how when they pray, they include the Psalms. For those who are, if you have Anglican friends, you know that you have things like this, the Book of Common Prayers, and the Psalms are included. And when we come to the Reformation, you see like Martin Luther, Paul's is a short Bible, right? Book of exemplar touching the whole of Christianity. For Calvin, he says that God puts the words in our mouth as if he himself was singing through us to exalt his glory. So for Martin Luther, it is a little Bible, right? Tells us the theology of the whole book of the Bible. For Calvin, it is like the psalmist is words that God has given us to sing it back to him, right? And Jesus himself said in the New Testament, these words which I spoke to you while I was with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses, prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. You see, written about me in the Psalms must be fulfilled. Now, the thing is, the words Jesus never appear at all in the Psalms. So how is it written? How is these things fulfilled in Jesus in the Psalm? For the next 5-10 minutes or so, I will try to succinctly share this with you. Okay. How does the book of Psalms speak of Jesus? Now, okay, I'll skip this. Basically, what this is trying to say is systematic theology about Christology don't really use the Old Testament. When you study systematic theology, typically they use New Testament. Okay, you see, there's a lack of Old Testament reference in the top 100. There are only 9 references. Christology, they're all New Testament. What I want to say is that Psalms is the most direct cited book in the New Testament, the book that Jesus quotes from most. Psalms are crucial, but they are not featured much in systematic theology. So what is the implication of this? That when we read backwards, that is when we read New Testament back to the Old Testament, we create a Christology that is based on how we understand Christ from the New Testament, rather than how the New Testament authors have understood Jesus as the fulfillment of Scripture. Now, this is, you have to read it again to understand what I'm trying to say. When we just try to understand Christology from New Testament, basically we are just doing that typically from ST. But the New Testament authors did not have New Testament. All they had was the Old Testament. So when they were trying to write the New Testament about Jesus, they were trying to figure out what the Old Testament say about Jesus that is being fulfilled. In other words, for us to understand Christ correctly, we need to also go back to the way the New Testament authors begin to understand Christ from the Old Testament. They were trying to read the Bible forward when they write the New Testament. And this is one way to read it. That is, we should read it forward. Okay? And that is one thing to do. And so the question back for us is then, how does Psalm speak of Jesus? Now, this guy, Eric Zenger, he says, the question of Psalter as a book is rather a question whether each psalm, with its inherent and specific language, may have yet another dimension of reading by its given position in the book of Psalms. It is whether the book as a whole has a program which cannot be precisely detected with a mere glance at the individual text. That is what he's saying is, if you want to see Christ, one of the things you could do is just look at the few Psalms the New Testament cites that applies to Jesus. Then what are you going to do with the rest of the Psalms? That's not quoted in the New Testament. What this guy is saying that actually, if you look at the whole Psalm as a whole, as a book, you see a big picture that actually describes the work of Christ. And I'm going to show you what this is. Okay, just ignore this. Basically, these are editing techniques that go beyond a single Psalm. I spent a lot of time sharing with you how to look at Hebrew poetry, but all I did was to do so within one Psalm, right? All we did was just look at Psalm 23, Psalm 67. It's just one Psalm. But what I'm trying to say here is actually all these techniques can apply beyond a single Psalm. That means you can have two Psalms that you can view, and you see this kind of techniques occurring across them. Okay, but I won't go through in detail. This is just to say they do happen. And 40 years ago, a guy like Jerry Wilson began to see that there is some kind of storyline across the whole book of Psalms. He is telling us, book 1, we see the establishment of the covenant with King David. Book 2, there's this celebration of his faithfulness to his covenant. And book 3, there's some kind of apparent failure because of sin. Book 4, the kingship of Yahweh and refuge of Israel. We see a high kingship of Yahweh, especially Psalms 90 and so on. And then book 5, there is this model exemplar, access to God through piousness. Now, you don't have to worry about this. What happens is that through this guy, suddenly we see something. There is some kind of coherent, organized framework across the whole book of the Psalter. These are different techniques, but we won't have time to look at it. I just want to share something broadly speaking. Now, maybe just very quickly here, you see that book 1 is from Psalm 1 all the way to 41. You can see that I have all these boxes here. You don't know what they mean, but basically you see that the kind of symmetry is now occurring across many different Psalms. Do you see that? Right, you have a supplication Psalm, and so on. This is EL is entrance liturgy at both ends, confident Psalms, lament Psalms, and you have a bunch of kingship Psalms at the center. So I won't bore you with this, but this is just to say that at the end, when you look at every single Psalm and their order and how they're arranged, you see lament here as a whole. At the center, you have a focus on Torah Psalm. You have a focus on Yahweh Kingship Psalms. And this is just book 1, right? You can do the same, which is what I did for my PhD, to look at the entire book of Psalms, books 1 to 5. And when I did that, what I see is that I see this. You have book 1, books 2 and 3, books 4 and 5. You see a storyline that goes with the idea of a Davidic kingship established, and then a Davidic kingship that falls, broken, and then a re-establishment of ideal King David. Similarly, there's an initial establishment of Zion. Zion falls, and then an ideal Zion is re-established. So you see this linear trajectory, a macro storyline that cuts across the whole book of the Psalter. Now, my point is this. Book 1 traces the establishment of both the Davidic kingship and Zion. Books 2 and 3 depict their fall and brokenness. And books 4 and 5 re-establishes this ideal Davidic kingship and Zion. So, as a whole, a nutshell, the Psalter looks forward to an ideal, secure, and just dwelling place brought about by a Messianic king. Okay, so this is the big picture. At the same time, it exhorts the reader to persevere in prayer and hope in view of Yahweh's covenantal promises. Now, so when you look at this logic, it gives us this macro view of God's purposes for his people. But where does it say anything about Jesus? I don't have time to talk about this, but I want to show you a key thing is the idea of Davidization of the Psalter. That is the idea that God uses this figure, David, to kind of link everything together, in particular, the Davidic covenant. Okay? Now, just look at this second point here. The primary way through which the prologue, Psalms 1 provide a Davidic profiling of the Psalter is through the motive, okay, of the Messianic king. And this Messianic king is most clearly depicted by the Davidic covenant. Now, what the Psalms do is using the Davidic figure and represent it as this Davidic king, Messianic king, and connects that with the idea of the Davidic covenant. Okay. Now, the Davidic covenant highlights these 8 things: a secure dwelling and rest with Yahweh at Zion. Just give me a few more minutes. Yahweh cutting off the enemies of David, building the house of God, moving the ark to Jerusalem. This idea of the language bestowed on the king, and the idea of God's steadfast love to the king, David's prayer, David and the people of God. Now, these are the key motifs in 2 Samuel 7, Davidic covenant. And these are, I submit to you, the same kind of motifs that you see cuts across the whole Psalms. Okay? Just now I give you the macro narrative, right? And this is what we see across the whole Psalm. And I wouldn't talk about this, but in a nutshell, this is what is happening. You have 2 Samuel 7, you have this movement, establishment, brokenness, re-establishment, still broken, and then we are waiting towards this final ideal state. Remember I said that the end of the psalm is a hallelujah. But it is through this ideal David, a blameless, suffering, triumphant priest king, that we begin to see how Christ is a part of these psalms. So through this Davidic figure, you have the earthly king, Davidic king, he fails, right? He's broken, he sins. But then you have this ideal Davidic king who comes and do something. He's blameless, but that he's suffering and brings about victory. But then the people of God is still broken, still waiting for that final ideal state. This is the big story that we see in the Psalms. And this is how it tells a story of God's work through Christ. Okay, so in a nutshell, it is that. Okay, my time is up. I don't want to bore you with the rest of this. You get the slides, but and you can read all this. The last point I want to make is this: how we read ourselves in the story. That is, when we read ourselves as being part of this trajectory, we are part of God's people that this king represents, then we join ourselves in this macro story. And that is how we relate to the whole of Psalms. And we can read our own journey into this macro meta-narrative of the Psalter. Okay, with that, I close, and maybe I give some time for Q&A and for those who want to ask questions. I'll pass the time back to the team and to James. And I just go through the slides that I have. But basically, if you want additional resources, I can point you to some. You might have some questions about the Bible Project. The Bible Project does produce a few very easy to understand. So you can take a look at them. There are some books that you can read if you are interested. If you want to learn Hebrew yourself, you can do so. You want to come to SVC, you can also do so. Okay, with that, I'll end.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Peter. It's such a wealth of knowledge, and there are treasures we can pick along the way, really. And the point really is that there is a narrative to the Psalms that is just beyond songs and emotions. There is an anticipation for it of the messianic person and the place of Zion that I think should all help us view that God's presence is something we can hold on to in the billows of life. So thank you so much, Dr. Peter, for those insightful sharing, and we're really grateful for the time that you've given us tonight. Now, we don't really have a time for a question, but is it possible for us to answer one more question? Would that be allowed?
Yeah. Well, for those who need to leave, you can leave after this. What I'm saying is, I'm happy to stay around for a bit more. For those with questions, you can stay back and ask. I'm happy to stay until 10 o'clock to answer your questions. Yeah.
I guess we can give one we can give time to one more question. We have one more question here from Taishan Chuan.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is this: besides an appreciation of the parallelism in Psalms as a literary tool, what is the spiritual significance of such poetry other than the meaning of words? Yeah, things like this, parallelism, the literary tools, the background information, the topology, the geography, the structure, and so on, all these are in service to the message of the psalm. Yeah. Semantic meaning of words and so on, all these serve to bring out a theological idea. So the work of interpreting the Psalms is to be able to identify what is the core, the theological message that the psalmist is trying to do. So for instance, when we talk about Psalm 67, I mean, after you have done all the nitty-gritty, interpretive stuff, you see that at the core of it is the character of God, like the justice of God, that enables the idea of blessing, that enables the idea of praise, and so on. So the central idea, in other words, when you preach Psalm 67, you have to emphasize the idea of God as the judge, and uprightness is justice, is character. If you talk about blessing, you talk about evangelism and all that, you're missing the point. In other words, what I'm trying to do is all these things at the end of the day is to help us identify the message, the core intent of what the psalmist is trying to say. Yeah. So these tools and techniques, they serve the message of the psalm. So it kind of crystallizes, show you more clearly what is the message of the psalm. Yeah. Yeah. So do you want to go one more or?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Peter. We really appreciate the time